You won't believe what this young boy had to endure at his new school. His parents wanted the best for him, but no one expected the cruelty and indifference he would face. Discover how he overcame this nightmare and what his father did to bring justice. Watch this video to the end, and I promise you'll be shocked. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Elijah sat quietly in the back seat as a car made its way through the unfamiliar streets of their new town. The hum of the engine was a low, constant presence, almost comforting against the uncertainty that bubbled within him. His parents sat in the front, their voices low as they spoke about what this move would mean for them all, particularly for Elijah. To his father, Judge Marcus Evans, this was more than just a move. It was a new beginning, a chance for a fresh start in a place that promised so much more for his family. For years, Judge Evans had dedicated his life to upholding justice. His reputation as a fair, honest, and incorruptible man was well known, and it was something he wore with pride. But beyond his professional life, there was a private man who wanted only the best for his son. He had watched Elijah grow into a thoughtful, intelligent boy, and, like any father, he had dreams of giving him opportunities he never had. The prestigious school Elijah was set to attend in this new town was supposed to be a step toward that goal. It was a school renowned for its academic rigor, its resources, and, most importantly, a safe environment where Elijah could thrive. At least, that was what Marcus and his wife Lillian believed. As they pulled up to their new home, a 2-story house nestled in a quiet neighborhood, Elijah felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. The house was bigger than their old one, with a wide front lawn and trees lining the driveway. It looked like the sort of place his parents had always talked about, a place where they could settle and build a future. His mother, Lillian, looked back at him with a reassuring smile as they parked. "Welcome home, Elijah," she said, her voice warm and full of hope. Elijah managed a small smile as he stepped out of the car, taking in his new surroundings. The air felt different here, fresher, as though this town held promises just waiting to be fulfilled. As they began to unpack, neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves, exchanging polite greetings and well wishes for their new start. It all seemed perfect on the surface, and for a moment, Elijah's fears began to fade. Maybe this place could be everything his parents hoped for. Maybe here he could find friends and a sense of belonging. The next day marked his first day at the new school. Elijah's parents had already prepared everything he needed, from a neatly packed lunch to a new set of clothes. They both wanted him to make a good first impression. His father had even given him a small pep talk before dropping him off, reminding him that he was strong and capable and that this was his chance to shine. Elijah took his father's words to heart as he walked through the school gates, his backpack feeling heavier than usual, though he wasn't sure if it was from the weight of his books or the nerves pressing down on him. Inside, the school looked exactly like the pictures his parents had shown him: clean hallways, bright classrooms, and lockers lined up in neat rows. But as soon as he entered his homeroom, he felt the weight of stares from his new classmates. Some whispered, some simply stared, and Elijah quickly felt his confidence wane. He kept his head down, making his way to an empty seat, hoping to blend in, hoping that the initial curiosity would wear off soon. The teacher, Mrs. Thompson, introduced him briefly to the class, and Elijah managed a polite nod before sitting down. He could feel the eyes of a few students still on him, but he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the lesson. It was easier said than done. One boy, in particular, seemed to be watching him with a keen interest. Elijah caught him whispering to his friends, followed by a few stifled laughs. He felt his stomach tighten, but he told himself it was nothing, just normal curiosity from kids who didn't know him yet. As the day progressed, however, that initial feeling of unease didn't fade. During lunch, Elijah sat alone at a table near the back of the cafeteria, watching as the groups of students filled the tables around him. He didn't know anyone here, and no one seemed particularly interested in reaching out. He reminded himself that it was just the first day, that things would get better once he settled in. Yet, a sense of loneliness crept over him, one he hadn't anticipated. Back home, his parents were eager to hear about his first day. They asked him about his classes, the teachers, and the other students. Elijah didn't have the heart to tell them about the stares, the whispers, or the uneasy feeling he'd had all day. Instead, he nodded and smiled, assuring them that it had been fine, that everyone seemed nice enough, and that he would probably make friends soon. He saw the relief on their faces, and it made him feel better, even if just for a moment. He didn't want to worry them, not when they had done so much to give him this opportunity. The following days, however, only seemed to reinforce that initial discomfort. Elijah noticed that the stares and whispers persisted, especially from the boy who seemed to be the ringleader, a kid named Derek. Derek was tall for his age, confident in a way that bordered on arrogance, and he seemed to have a certain influence over the other boys in class. Wherever Elijah went, Derek wasn't far behind, often making snide comments just loud enough for Elijah to hear. "Hey, new kid, think you're special?" he'd sneer, or, "Didn't anyone teach you to stay in your place?" Elijah tried to ignore it, to focus on his studies and keep his head down. He told himself that if he didn't react, if he didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him upset, they'd eventually lose interest. But the taunts only grew louder, and the group around Derek seemed to thrive off of his mockery. Elijah found himself dreading each day, feeling the weight of his backpack and the isolation that came with it. At home, he kept up the facade, smiling and nodding, assuring his parents that everything was fine. But the truth was, he was beginning to feel trapped. The school, which was supposed to be a place of opportunity and safety, had become a place of anxiety and loneliness. The dreams his parents had for him, the hopes they held, seemed to slip further away with each passing day. His father, though, started noticing the cracks in his son's cheerful front. Marcus had always been an observant man, and he could see that something was troubling Elijah. The boy was quieter than usual, spending more time in his room, and his once bright eyes seemed dimmer, as though a shadow had settled over him. Marcus tried asking Elijah if everything was okay, but Elijah only shrugged, forcing a smile and saying he was just tired. Yet, that lingering feeling of unease gnawed at Marcus. He didn't press his son further, but the sense that something was wrong stayed with him, a quiet worry he couldn't shake. In the quiet of their new home, Elijah wrestled with his own fears and doubts, unsure of how to break free from the loneliness that clung to him. He didn't want to burden his parents, especially when they had done so much to give him this chance. He didn't want them to see him struggling. And so, he carried his pain alone, hoping somehow that things would get better, that the shadows following him would eventually fade. As the days went on, Elijah's unease grew. The whispers and stares had become his new normal, but they were only the beginning. Elijah soon found himself facing not just looks and comments, but active hostility. Derek, the boy who had led the taunts from day one, seemed determined to make Elijah feel unwelcome in every possible way. Derek would pass by Elijah's desk and mutter under his breath, calling him loser, freak, or outcast. Sometimes he'd knock Elijah's books to the floor, sneering as Elijah knelt to pick them up. Every time Elijah told himself it was just harmless teasing. He tried not to let it get to him, but as the days went by, Derek's behavior became bolder, and he wasn't the only one. A few other boys joined in, following Derek's lead, encouraged by his boldness and the attention it brought them. Elijah's life in school was quickly turning into a daily ordeal, and it was clear that Derek was only getting started. One afternoon during biology class, Elijah's teacher, Mr. Hudson, called on him to answer a question about the lesson. Elijah hadn't heard the question clearly because of the whispers and giggles coming from Derek and his friends in the back of the room, but he tried to piece together an answer. Mr. Hudson listened to his response with a blank expression, then sighed dramatically, causing the whole class to snicker. "Elijah," he said slowly, as though speaking to a child much younger, "maybe if you spent a little less time daydreaming and a little more time paying attention, you'd actually understand the lesson." The remark hung in the air, cutting Elijah to the bone. The other students' laughter only made it worse, ringing in his ears like a cruel soundtrack to his humiliation. Mr. Hudson didn't stop there. Throughout the class, he would make snide remarks about Elijah's abilities, rolling his eyes whenever Elijah tried to answer a question. It was hard for Elijah to understand why Mr. Hudson had taken such a disliking to him, but it didn't take long for him to notice a pattern. The teacher would often single him out, pointing out even the smallest mistakes. Elijah tried his hardest to meet Mr. Hudson's expectations, but nothing he did seemed to please him. Instead, it seemed to make Mr. Hudson even more dismissive, as if Elijah's attempts were somehow insulting to him. Elijah began dreading biology class more than any other. Mr. Hudson's disdain and Derek's constant presence were a potent combination, making each lesson a nightmare. The teacher would continue to belittle him, and Derek, picking up on Mr. Hudson's lead, would go out of his way to make the experience as miserable as possible. If Elijah answered a question incorrectly, Derek would laugh the loudest, making sure everyone else joined in. If he got something right, Derek would still find a way to mock him, muttering, "Guess even a broken clock is right twice a day." During lunch, things weren't much better. Derek and his friends would often take the opportunity to humiliate him, pushing him as they passed by or stealing his lunch. Elijah took to eating in secluded corners where he hoped they wouldn't find him, but they always did. Derek would lean over his shoulder, whispering insults, or casually spilling something on him by accident. Elijah's clothes were stained more often than not, and the teachers, if they noticed, never said a word. Days turned into weeks, and the cycle continued, growing more vicious with each passing day. The constant bullying started to take a toll on Elijah, leaving him exhausted, both mentally and physically. He found it harder and harder to focus in class, and his grades, which had once been strong, began to slip. At night, he would lie awake, thinking about the next day and all the ways he might be tormented. The one place where he had once found comfort, his studies, was now a source of stress, as he feared Mr. Hudson's disdain and Derek's mockery. Yet, when he went home, Elijah kept everything to himself. He plastered on a smile for his parents, insisting that everything was fine, that he was just adjusting to the new school. He didn't want to worry them, didn't want them to know how badly he was struggling. His parents had sacrificed so much to give him this chance, and he felt as though he'd be letting them down if he told them the truth. So, he bore the burden alone, letting the weight of it crush him little by little. His father, however, was beginning to sense that something was wrong. Marcus Evans had always been a perceptive man, and he could see that his son was not the same cheerful, curious boy he had been before the move. Elijah was quieter, withdrawn, and his smiles didn't reach his eyes the way they used to. Marcus would ask him how things were going, and Elijah would always say it was fine, just busy, just different. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface. One evening, Marcus and his wife, Lillian, discussed their concerns in low voices, careful not to let Elijah overhear. They agreed to keep an eye on him, to be there if he ever wanted to talk. But for now, they trusted that he would open up when he was ready. Little did they know, Elijah was sinking deeper into isolation, his spirit chipped away by the relentless cruelty he faced each day. Back at school, Derek's behavior escalated further. Now, he didn't just rely on words. He'd sometimes shove Elijah in the halls or kick his chair during class, leaving bruises both visible and hidden. Other students watched, some laughing, others turning away, unwilling to intervene. Elijah learned quickly that no one was going to help him, that he was on his own in a school filled with people who either enjoyed his suffering or ignored it altogether. But the worst came in biology, where Mr. Hudson continued to set the tone for how others could treat Elijah. One day, when Elijah hesitated over a question, Mr. Hudson sneered, "Really, Elijah? I would expect someone in this school to be able to keep up. Or maybe this school just isn't the right fit for everyone." The implication was clear, and Elijah felt it like a blow. He had tried so hard to prove himself to fit in, but now even his teacher was making it clear that he didn't belong. And Derek, catching Mr. Hudson's tone, seized on it, laughing loudly and encouraging the others to join in. It became harder and harder for Elijah to even muster the courage to go to school each morning. He knew what awaited him, knew that each day would bring new humiliation and pain. But he continued to hide it from his parents, bottling it up inside, afraid of burdening them. In his mind, this was his struggle alone, something he had to endure on his own. At night, he found himself staring at the ceiling, the words of Derek, Mr. Hudson, and his classmates echoing in his mind. The confidence he had once had was gone, replaced by a gnawing doubt and fear that he could not shake. He felt trapped, unable to escape the daily torment that had become his life. Yet despite the mounting pain, Elijah clung to the hope that somehow things would get better. Maybe Derek would lose interest. Maybe Mr. Hudson would start treating him fairly. Maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way out of this nightmare. Until then, he resolved to keep his head down and endure, holding on to whatever small glimmer of hope he had left. The bullying continued to escalate. Elijah had come to expect Derek's taunts and Mr. Hudson's disdain, but now the bullying had turned physical, becoming a daily ordeal that he could no longer ignore or escape. Derek's casual shoves in the hallway became harder, more intentional. Sometimes he'd be tripped on his way to his desk, or have his books knocked out of his hands. Elijah tried to brush it off, but each day it chipped away at him a little more. One day, as Elijah made his way to his locker after lunch, he was cornered by Derek and two of his friends, Mike and Aaron. They blocked his path, smirking as Elijah looked around, hoping for a teacher or another student to intervene. But no one was there. Derek's smirk widened as he took a step closer. "Think you're too good for us, huh, new kid?" Derek sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Elijah tried to keep his composure, his hands tightening around his books. "I don't want any trouble, Derek," he replied softly, hoping to diffuse the situation, but Derek only laughed, his eyes glinting with malice. Trouble? You're the one causing trouble by just being here. You don't belong in our school. Before Elijah could respond, Derek snatched the books from his hands and tossed them across the hallway. Elijah took a step forward, but Mike and Aaron blocked him, shoving him back against the lockers. Elijah felt the cold metal press against his back as fear gripped him. "Leave me alone," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek leaned in close, his expression darkening. "Or what?" he taunted. "You gonna cry? Go running to Mommy and Daddy?" The other boys laughed, and Elijah's face flushed with shame and anger, but he didn't dare respond. He knew that anything he said would only make things worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Derek and his friends walked away, leaving Elijah to retrieve his scattered books in silence. He wanted to scream, to yell, to make them understand how much this was hurting him. But he swallowed the words, forced himself to keep it all inside, just like he always did. The worst incident happened later that week. Elijah had been doing his best to avoid Derek, taking different routes to class and staying out of sight during breaks. But Derek seemed to sense his attempts and made it a point to seek him out. During lunch, Elijah slipped away to the bathroom, hoping for a moment of peace. He splashed water on his face, staring at his reflection, wondering when everything had gone so wrong. He missed the days when he could go to school without fear, without feeling like he was constantly looking over his shoulder. As he turned to leave the bathroom, he froze. Derek, Mike, and Aaron stood by the entrance, blocking his way out. Elijah's heart sank as he realized there was no way to escape. "You've been hiding from us," Derek sneered, stepping closer. "What, you think you're too good to hang out with us now?" Elijah's voice trembled as he replied, "I just want to be left alone." Derek's face twisted into a mocking grin. "Left alone? You're the one making trouble just by being here." He gestured to Mike and Aaron, who moved forward, closing in on Elijah until he was backed into a corner. Before he could even process what was happening, they grabbed him, pinning his arms so he couldn't move. Elijah struggled, panic rising in his chest, but he was outnumbered. Derek moved closer, his eyes filled with a cruel satisfaction. "You need to learn your place," he said, and with a swift motion he punched Elijah in the stomach, knocking the breath out of him. Elijah gasped, feeling the air rush out of his lungs as pain radiated through his body. The boys didn't stop there. They shoved him to the floor, laughing as he tried to crawl away. Elijah's vision blurred with tears, but he could hear their laughter echoing around the bathroom, taunting him, reminding him of how powerless he was. His heart pounded as he realized there was no escape, no one to help him. Finally, Derek grabbed him by the collar and pulled him up, forcing him to look him in the eyes. "You think you're better than us? Think again." With a cruel grin, Derek dragged him over to the toilet and shoved his head down, pushing his face toward the water. Elijah struggled, feeling the cold porcelain against his cheek, the stench making him gag. He twisted and turned, trying to break free, but Derek's grip was too strong. Derek shoved his head down further, laughing as Elijah's face hovered just inches from the filthy water. "Say you're sorry," Derek taunted. "Say you're sorry for coming here and thinking you're better than us." Elijah couldn't find his voice. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, humiliation, and anger. He felt tears streaming down his face, but he didn't dare make a sound. Derek's grip tightened. his laughter growing louder as he pressed Elijah's face closer to the water. "Say it," Derek demanded. "I'm sorry," Elijah finally managed to choke out, his voice barely audible. Derek released him, shoving him to the floor as he and his friends laughed. Elijah lay there, too shaken to move, feeling the weight of his shame pressing down on him. His body ached, his heart felt shattered, and all he could do was lie there, wondering if this would ever end. When he finally made it out of the bathroom, Elijah went straight to a secluded corner of the schoolyard, away from the other students. He couldn't bear the thought of anyone seeing him like this, of knowing what he had endured. He sat there in silence, hugging his knees to his chest, feeling as though he'd been hollowed out. The sense of isolation he'd felt before was nothing compared to the emptiness that filled him now. For the rest of the day, Elijah went through the motions, barely registering the world around him. His teachers' voices were distant, their lessons meaningless as he replayed the incident in his mind, over and over. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone, afraid that they would somehow know, that they would see the shame written all over his face. When he got home that evening, he managed to put on a brave face for his parents. He forced a smile, answered their questions in short, cheerful replies, and assured them that everything was fine. But his father watched him closely, his eyes filled with quiet concern. Marcus could see the tension in his son's shoulders, the shadows in his eyes. He knew that something was wrong, but Elijah kept his guard up, refusing to let anyone see the pain he was carrying. That night, Elijah lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his body aching from the bruises and his heart heavy with shame. He couldn't bring himself to tell his parents, couldn't bear the thought of them knowing what he had been through. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of his own silence, but he didn't see any other option. This was his battle, his burden to bear, and he was determined not to let it break him. But deep down, a part of him wondered how much longer he could endure it, how many more times he could face Derek and his friends without losing himself completely. The school that was supposed to be a place of opportunity and safety had become a place of torment, and Elijah could feel himself slipping further and further into despair with no way out in sight. The school announced an upcoming field trip to the city zoo, an event meant to be a fun, educational escape from the usual routine. Elijah wasn't sure how he felt about it. The idea of spending an entire day with his classmates, especially Derek and his friends, filled him with dread. But he also felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be different. Maybe, in a different environment, he could avoid their attention, blend into the group, and just enjoy the day. When Elijah told his parents about the trip, his father, Judge Marcus Evans, noticed the hesitation in his voice. Elijah's unease had not gone unnoticed over the past weeks. Marcus had watched his son grow quieter, more reserved, the brightness in his eyes dimming with each passing day. He had tried to get Elijah to open up, to talk about what was bothering him, but Elijah had always shrugged it off, saying he was just adjusting. Still, Marcus sensed there was more to it, something Elijah was struggling to hide. When Marcus heard about the zoo trip, an idea came to him. He would take a day off from work, something he rarely did, and follow the class from a distance. Perhaps, by observing Elijah in his school environment, he could get a clearer sense of what was going on. He was careful not to let Elijah or anyone else know his plan, wanting to avoid causing his son any embarrassment. Marcus hoped he was wrong, that he'd spend the day watching Elijah enjoy himself, free from whatever burdens he seemed to be carrying. The day of the trip arrived, and Elijah joined his classmates on the school bus. He found a seat near the back, hoping to remain as inconspicuous as possible. Derek and his friends were seated a few rows ahead, already whispering and laughing amongst themselves. Elijah tried to focus on the view outside the window, blocking out their voices, telling himself that he just had to get through the day. Meanwhile, Marcus followed the bus in his car, keeping a safe distance. He felt a pang of guilt for spying on his son, but the concern gnawing at him was too strong to ignore. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, that his son was facing something beyond what he was willing to admit. Once they arrived at the zoo, the students filed out of the bus, each grouping up with friends or classmates. Elijah stood by himself, lingering at the edge of the crowd. The teachers, including Mr. Hudson, began dividing the students into smaller groups for the tour. Marcus observed from a distance, noting how Elijah stayed apart, not engaging with any of his peers. The sight made Marcus's chest tighten, confirming his suspicions that his son was isolated, perhaps even ostracized. As the groups moved from one exhibit to another, Marcus kept a close eye on Elijah. He noticed how Derek and his friends would occasionally look back at Elijah, whispering to each other and laughing. Marcus felt his fists clench involuntarily. A wave of anger washed over him. He didn't know the specifics, but he could see enough to understand that these boys were targeting his son. The class reached the reptile house, where the students gathered around a large glass enclosure holding a massive alligator. The creature lay still, its eyes half closed, its powerful jaws slightly open. The teacher began explaining the habits and characteristics of alligators, but Marcus noticed that his son wasn't focused on the lesson. Elijah was standing toward the back of the group, his gaze fixed downward, seemingly lost in his thoughts. It was then that Marcus saw Mr. Hudson look back and notice Elijah standing alone. There was a slight smirk on the teacher's face as he nudged Derek, whispering something to him. Derek grinned and nodded, and within moments he and his friends were making their way toward Elijah. Marcus's heart began to pound, an instinctive sense of foreboding settling over him as he watched. Derek walked up to Elijah and put a hand on his shoulder, gripping it tightly. "Come on, Elijah," he said, his voice laced with mock friendliness. "Don't be shy. You should come up front, get a better view." Elijah looked around nervously, aware that the teacher and the other students were watching. He tried to pull away, but Derek's grip tightened. "Let go of me," Elijah whispered, his voice shaky, but Derek only smirked, his hand pushing Elijah forward. "Come on, don't be a coward." Before Elijah could protest further, Derek and his friends guided him to the front of the group, right up to the edge of the enclosure. Mr. Hudson stood nearby, a look of detached amusement on his face as he watched the scene unfold. Marcus, watching from a distance, felt a surge of rage as he realized what was happening. He started moving closer, his heart pounding, but he didn't want to draw attention to himself until he understood the full extent of the situation. Derek and his friends positioned Elijah directly in front of the glass, inches away from the alligator on the other side. "You know, they say these things can leap right through the glass if they're hungry enough," Derek said, his voice filled with a sinister glee. Elijah's face drained of color, his eyes wide with fear as he looked from Derek to the glass, then back again. The other students, sensing the tension, began to laugh and whisper, their eyes fixed on Elijah's frightened expression. Mr. Hudson didn't intervene, standing by with a slight smirk as though this was all just harmless fun. But to Elijah, it was anything but. His heart raced as he stared at the alligator, its cold, unblinking eyes seeming to fix on him. Derek leaned in close to Elijah, his voice low but filled with malice. "Maybe, if you tap on the glass, it'll get interested," he whispered. Elijah shook his head, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to keep himself steady. He felt trapped, cornered, with no way to escape. He glanced at Mr. Hudson, hoping for help, but the teacher only looked back at him with that same expression of amusement, as if he were enjoying every second of Elijah's terror. And then Derek pushed him. It was a small shove, but it was enough to make Elijah stumble forward, his face nearly pressing against the glass. The alligator stirred, its body shifting slightly, its eyes narrowing as it focused on the movement in front of it. Elijah felt a chill run down his spine, a primal fear taking hold of him as he stared into the predator's cold gaze. In that moment, Marcus burst through the crowd, his voice ringing out, "Get away from him!" The force of his voice cut through the laughter and whispers, and all eyes turned to him in shock. Marcus strode forward, his expression fierce, and pulled Elijah back, wrapping a protective arm around his son. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" Marcus demanded, his voice filled with barely restrained fury as he looked at Mr. Hudson, then at Derek and his friends. Mr. Hudson's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of surprise and discomfort. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. I'm not sure what you're talking about, sir," he stammered. "We were just observing the exhibit." "Observing?" Marcus's voice was cold, cutting. "I saw what you were doing. You stood there and let these boys torment my son, and you did nothing to stop it." The other students fell silent, sensing the intensity of the moment. Derek and his friends shrank back, their expressions shifting from amusement to discomfort and guilt. Elijah clung to his father's side, feeling both relieved and overwhelmed. He hadn't expected his father to be there, hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him like this. Mr. Hudson's face flushed and he stammered, I didn't realize." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "You didn't realize and you didn't care. You are responsible for the safety and well-being of every student here, yet you allowed my son to be bullied and endangered for your own amusement." The students and teachers watched in stunned silence as Marcus led Elijah away, his arm around his son's shoulders. Elijah felt a wave of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a deep, profound sense of safety he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, he felt that he wasn't alone, that someone was willing to fight for him, to stand by his side. As they left the zoo, Elijah glanced up at his father, feeling a surge of gratitude and admiration. He had tried to hide his pain, tried to carry the burden alone, but now he realized that he didn't have to. His father's presence, his strength, reminded him that he was not as powerless as he had felt. But as they made their way home, Marcus's expression remained tense. He had seen enough to know that this was not an isolated incident, that his son had been enduring far more than he had let on. And he knew without a doubt that this was only the beginning of a battle for justice and accountability. The day after the zoo incident, Marcus Evans was done standing by. He could no longer ignore the pain in Elijah's eyes, or the way his son shrank into himself whenever school was mentioned. As a judge, Marcus had spent years defending others and fighting for justice, but this time it was personal. He would not let his son suffer in silence anymore. That evening, he sat Elijah down and asked him to tell him everything. Every taunt, every shove, every cruel word. At first, Elijah hesitated, feeling the weight of his silence press against him, but with his father's gentle urging, he finally opened up, the words spilling out as he recounted the months of bullying he'd endured. Marcus listened in silence, his heart breaking with each word. The pain, the fear, the humiliation his son had experienced, it was almost unbearable to hear. But Marcus kept his composure, knowing that Elijah needed his strength now more than ever. The next day, Marcus went to the school and met with the administration, demanding answers. He presented the full account of what Elijah had endured, from Derek's bullying to Mr. Hudson's indifference and even encouragement. The principal and other staff members seemed taken aback, stumbling over apologies and excuses, but Marcus was having none of it. He could see that they were more interested in protecting the school's reputation than actually addressing the harm that had been done to his son. When he made it clear that he intended to take legal action, the principal's face turned pale. Marcus didn't care. He was determined to bring justice not only for Elijah, but for any other child who had been made to feel unsafe in that school. He filed a lawsuit against the school, Mr. Hudson, and the students involved in the bullying. His intention was clear. He wanted to shine a light on the system that had allowed his son's suffering to go unchecked. The news of the lawsuit spread quickly, drawing the attention of the community. Many parents were shocked and outraged, unable to believe that such cruelty could have taken place within the walls of their prestigious school. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial with members of the community, parents, and even some of Elijah's classmates filling the seats. Marcus stood before the court, not just as a father, but as a representative of every child who had ever been bullied or mistreated. He presented his case with precision and passion, detailing the abuse Elijah had endured and the failures of those who were supposed to protect him. He called witnesses to the stand, including students who had seen Derek's bullying firsthand. Though some were reluctant, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The most damning testimony came from Elijah himself. When he took the stand, his voice trembled, but he spoke with a quiet strength that left the courtroom silent. He recounted the incidents in painful detail, from the whispers and shoves to the zoo trip where he had been humiliated and frightened in front of everyone. He spoke about Mr. Hudson's dismissive attitude, how the teacher had watched his suffering with a smirk, never once intervening. Elijah's words painted a picture of isolation and despair that was impossible to ignore. As Elijah finished his testimony, he looked over at his father, who gave him a nod of encouragement. In that moment, Elijah felt a surge of relief. He had finally been heard. His voice, which he had kept silent for so long, now echoed through the courtroom, a testament to his resilience. The defense tried to paint Derek and his friends as just boys being boys, dismissing their actions as harmless pranks. They argued that Mr. Hudson's behavior was simply a misunderstanding, that he had no intention of causing harm. But Marcus was relentless, countering each argument with cold, hard facts, presenting evidence of the emotional and psychological toll the bullying had taken on his son. He spoke about the responsibilities that teachers and schools have to their students, the duty of care that had been grossly neglected in Elijah's case. As the trial went on, it became clear that the community was divided. Some parents sympathized with Marcus and Elijah, expressing their support and outrage at the events that had unfolded. But others, particularly the parents of Derek and his friends, grew defensive, unwilling to believe that their children could be capable of such cruelty. They argued that Marcus was overreacting, that his lawsuit was an attempt to tarnish the school's reputation. But Marcus didn't waver. He was there for his son, and nothing else mattered. One of the most intense moments of the trial came when Mr. Hudson took the stand. The teacher was visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as Marcus questioned him about his actions, or lack thereof. Marcus asked him directly why he had never intervened, why he had allowed Elijah to be humiliated day after day without lifting a finger to stop it. Mr. Hudson stammered, offering weak excuses about not wanting to interfere in harmless interactions between students. But Marcus pressed him, his voice steady and unyielding. Is it harmless to push a child toward an enclosure with a dangerous animal? Is it harmless to mock and belittle a student in front of his classmates? Mr. Hudson faltered, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. The silence in the courtroom was heavy as everyone waited for his response. Finally, he muttered, "I didn't think it was that serious." Marcus's voice was cold as he replied, "You didn't think." "That's exactly the problem. You failed to protect my son when he needed you the most. You failed to fulfill your duty as an educator, and because of that, my son suffered." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the responsibility that had been neglected. Mr. Hudson had no answer, his face flushed with shame as he lowered his head. As the trial neared its conclusion, Marcus made his final arguments, speaking not only as a father but as an advocate for every child who had ever been bullied or ignored. He called for accountability, for change, and for justice. He urged the court to set an example, to show that such behavior would not be tolerated, not in any school, not in any community. The judge presiding over the case listened intently, his expression serious as he considered the arguments on both sides. When he finally delivered his verdict, the courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on him. He ruled in favor of Marcus and Elijah, ordering the school to pay damages and mandating a review of its policies on bullying and teacher conduct. Mr. Hudson was reprimanded, placed under investigation, and ultimately lost his position. For Derek and his friends, the consequences were severe. They were suspended from school and required to undergo counseling. The court made it clear that their actions were not harmless pranks, but acts of cruelty that had caused significant harm. Their parents, some of whom had been dismissive and defensive throughout the trial, were forced to confront the reality of their children's behavior. As the verdict was read, Elijah felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had been heard, his suffering acknowledged, and justice served. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that the people who had hurt him were being held accountable. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a proud, reassuring smile. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager for a statement. Marcus stood with Elijah by his side, his voice strong as he spoke about the importance of standing up against bullying and holding those in power accountable. He expressed his hope that the case would bring about change, not just in that school, but in every school where children like Elijah might be suffering in silence. As they left, Marcus turned to Elijah, his expression softening. "You were brave, son," he said quietly, "braver than I could ever have imagined." Elijah looked up at his father, a sense of pride and gratitude filling him. He had been through so much, but he had come out stronger. And he knew, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would never be alone again. His father, his protector, would always be by his side. The courtroom battle had ended, but the journey for Elijah and his family was far from over. In the days following the trial, Elijah returned to school, though with a new sense of apprehension. The atmosphere had changed. Students now knew about the lawsuit, the bullying, and the school's failure to protect him. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a few with resentment. But Elijah held his head high. He had been through enough, and he knew he didn't have to face this alone anymore. At home, Elijah's parents watched him carefully, supporting him as he worked through the lingering effects of his trauma. There were moments when the memories of the bullying would resurface, bringing with them flashes of fear and shame. But Elijah reminded himself of the strength he had found, both in himself and in his father's unwavering support. One weekend, as they sat in the living room, Marcus suggested that Elijah try meeting with a counselor. Elijah hesitated at first, the idea of discussing his feelings with a stranger making him feel vulnerable. But with gentle encouragement from his parents, he agreed to give it a try. His first session was difficult. He struggled to find the words to describe the pain he had kept bottled up for so long. But over time, he began to open up, allowing himself to process the events that had shaken him to his core. In the weeks that followed, Elijah found solace not only in his therapy sessions, but also in the newfound openness with his parents. The silence that had once hung over their conversations was gone, replaced by trust and understanding. Marcus and Lillian encouraged him to talk about his day, his thoughts, and his fears, creating a space where Elijah could finally feel safe. Meanwhile, the school had been forced to implement new policies in response to the lawsuit. They introduced stricter guidelines on bullying and harassment, along with mandatory training sessions for teachers and staff. Marcus's actions had set off a ripple effect, and other parents began to speak up, sharing their own concerns and experiences. The community was awakening to the importance of protecting its children, and Elijah's case became a catalyst for change. One afternoon, Elijah received a letter from the school inviting him to join a newly formed student committee aimed at addressing issues of bullying and inclusivity. The principal, who had been defensive during the trial, now seemed committed to making amends, acknowledging that the school had failed Elijah and promising to do better. Elijah felt a mixture of emotions as he read the letter: pride, hope, and a lingering sense of caution. But he accepted the invitation, realizing that this was an opportunity to help others who might be going through what he had experienced. As he attended his first committee meeting, Elijah felt a sense of purpose taking root within him. The other students, some of whom had once ignored him, now looked to him with respect, recognizing the strength it had taken to stand up for himself and others. For the first time, he felt as though he had a voice, and he was determined to use it. At home, his parents noticed the change. Elijah smiled more often, and though he still had moments of doubt, the light in his eyes was beginning to return. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Marcus looked across the table at his son, his heart swelling with pride. "I hope you know how proud we are of you, Elijah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you went through, it was hard, and I wish you hadn't had to face it. But you did, and you came out stronger." Elijah looked up, meeting his father's gaze. For so long he had felt small, invisible, and powerless. But now, sitting with his family, he felt a strength that went beyond physical resilience. He had faced his fears, confronted his pain, and found a way forward. And he knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would have his family's love and support to guide him. In the months that followed, Elijah continued to grow. He threw himself into his studies, rediscovering the joy he had once felt in learning. The shadows of the past began to fade, replaced by a sense of hope and determination. He made a few new friends on the committee, students who shared his passion for creating a safer, more inclusive environment for everyone. One day, as he walked through the halls of his school, he caught sight of Derek. The boy who had once tormented him now avoided his gaze, his arrogance replaced by a visible discomfort. Derek had returned to school after his suspension, but the trial and its consequences had left a mark on him as well. Elijah felt a mix of emotions as he watched Derek pass by. There was no triumph in seeing his former bully brought low, only a quiet resolve. Elijah understood that his true victory lay not in revenge, but in reclaiming his life and his sense of self. Elijah's newfound confidence didn't go unnoticed. Teachers, including those who had once ignored his suffering, now showed him respect, acknowledging his strength and resilience. Mr. Hudson, who had lost his position after the trial, was no longer a presence in Elijah's life, a fact that brought him a deep sense of relief. With each passing day, Elijah felt himself moving beyond the pain, leaving behind the fear and insecurity that had once held him captive. As the school year drew to a close, Elijah looked back on everything he had endured and everything he had overcome. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for his family, for his father's determination, and for the chance to rebuild his life. He had come to understand that his strength wasn't defined by his ability to endure pain, but by his courage to face it, to seek help, and to stand up for himself. On the last day of school, Elijah's parents surprised him with a small celebration, marking the end of a challenging year and the beginning of a new chapter. As they sat together, laughing and reminiscing, Elijah felt a warmth in his heart that he hadn't felt in a long time. He realized that he had come full circle, emerging from the darkness stronger, wiser, and with a newfound sense of purpose. Looking forward, Elijah knew that life would still have its challenges, but he was ready to face them head-on. He had found his voice, his strength, and his resilience, and with his family by his side, he felt unstoppable. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had shaped him into the person he was becoming, a person he was finally proud to be. In the months following the trial, life took on a new rhythm for Elijah and his family. The weight that had once hung over their home had lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and determination. For Elijah, the trial was more than just a public declaration of the wrongs he had endured. It was a turning point that marked the beginning of his healing journey. He knew that the scars left by Derek, Mr. Hudson, and the relentless bullying would take time to heal, but he also felt stronger, more resilient, and ready to rebuild. At first, returning to school was daunting. Every hallway and classroom seemed to echo with memories of the torment he had endured. Some classmates avoided eye contact, others gave him polite nods, and a few came up to apologize for their silence during the months he'd suffered. It was a strange mix of emotions. Elijah felt both proud of his newfound respect and slightly resentful that it had taken something as drastic as a lawsuit for people to see him differently. One afternoon after school, as Elijah sat in his room reading, he heard a knock at the door. His mother, Lillian, entered with a gentle smile and a small box wrapped in blue paper. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft. "Your father and I wanted to give you something, a little token to remind you of how strong you are." Elijah took the box, his fingers tracing the smooth wrapping paper. With a quick tug, he opened it, revealing a delicate silver bracelet. Etched into the metal was a single word: courage. Elijah's eyes filled with tears as he held the bracelet, feeling the weight of its meaning settle over him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've shown more courage than anyone I know, Elijah," Lillian said, her hand resting on his shoulder. "This is to remind you that, no matter what, you always have that strength within you." He slipped the bracelet onto his wrist, feeling its cool weight against his skin. It was a small gesture, but to Elijah, it meant everything. His family had stood by him through the darkest moments, and now, with their love and support, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the weeks went by, Elijah's confidence continued to grow. He became more involved in the school's new student committee on bullying and inclusion, where he met students who shared his determination to create a safer environment. They worked together to organize events, spread awareness, and encourage open dialogue about bullying. Elijah discovered a passion for helping others find their voices, especially those who felt invisible or overlooked. One Friday evening, Elijah's father, Marcus, invited him to join him in his study. The walls were lined with books, awards, and mementos from Marcus's years of service as a judge. It was a room Elijah had always admired, a place that represented justice and fairness. Marcus sat across from him, his gaze steady and proud. "You know, son," Marcus began, "I've always believed in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. What we went through together, it reminded me why I chose this path." Elijah listened, captivated by the seriousness in his father's voice. "I want you to know," Marcus continued, "that no matter where life takes you, your voice matters. You have a power within you to make a difference, not just for yourself, but for others." Elijah felt a surge of gratitude and respect for his father. Marcus had taught him not only about justice, but about courage, resilience, and compassion. The trial had changed them both, bringing them closer and instilling a deeper understanding of what it meant to fight for what was right. As the year drew to a close, Elijah found himself reflecting on the transformation he had undergone. He was no longer the frightened boy who had once felt invisible in the crowded hallways. Now, he was a young man with a voice, a purpose, and a family who believed in him. The pain he had endured had not broken him. It had shaped him, making him stronger and more compassionate. One afternoon, Elijah's family organized a small gathering at their home, inviting a few close friends, neighbors, and some of his new allies from the student committee. It was a simple celebration of resilience and new beginnings, a reminder of how far Elijah had come. As they laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed each other's company, Elijah felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. Later that evening, as the guests left and the house grew quiet, Elijah sat outside with his parents watching the stars fill the sky. Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a silent gesture of pride and support. "You know, Elijah," he said, his voice soft, "this is just the beginning. There's so much ahead of you, so many opportunities to make a difference." Elijah looked up at the sky, his heart swelling with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew that the road ahead would have its challenges, but with his family by his side and a newfound purpose guiding him, he felt ready to face anything. As they sat together in the cool evening air, Elijah realized that he was no longer defined by the pain he had endured. He was defined by his strength, his courage, and the love of a family who had stood by him through it all. And with that knowledge, he was ready to step into the future, a future he now saw as bright, boundless, and filled with possibility. Marcus finally achieved justice for his son, exposing the truth and ensuring that those responsible were held accountable. This story shows the importance of standing up for those we love and never turning a blind eye to injustice. If you believe that cases like this shouldn't go unnoticed, please leave a comment, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to bring more stories like this to light. Let us know in the comments what you think about this situation and how you would have handled it if you were in Marcus's place. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.